A 9-year-old boy staggered through the blinding snow, his thin arms straining as he carried his little sister across the frozen street. Her pink sweater was soaked, her breath shallow, fading with every step. The clinic doors had just slammed in their faces. No papers, no help, no mercy. Alone in the storm, they seemed forgotten by the world, until the crunch of boots in the snow stopped them. A soldier in a worn coat stood watching, and at his side, a German shepherd lowered its head, eyes fixed on the children as if it had been waiting for this very moment. The wind carried needles of ice through the narrow streets of Rivers Bend, Colorado, a mountain town that in winter felt less like a place for people and more like a half-forgotten outpost clinging to survival against the storm. The snow was piled against shuttered storefronts, burying the sidewalks in uneven drifts, and every breath burned with the cold. Street lamps glowed faintly through the swirling white, halos trembling as if they too were weary of the endless night. And in that darkness walked a boy, no more than 9 years old, his thin frame swallowed in a frayed blue sweater that had once been his father's before shrinking in a stranger's laundry. Caleb Hawthorne's face was pale, his lips cracked, but his hazel eyes carried a fire older than his years, the kind of steady determination that only children who had lost too much too soon could bear. On his back, slumped against him as though she were weightless, rode his sister Emma, 6 years old, her small arms dangling around his neck. She wore a pink woolen sweater, sleeves unraveling at the cuffs, her breath hot against his shoulder, yet frighteningly shallow, her forehead fevered. Strands of her light brown hair clung to her damp skin, and though she stirred faintly, her voice never rose above a whisper. Every step Caleb took sank into the snow. Every stumble threatened to topple them both, but he pressed forward because stopping meant death, and he could not let her go, not after everything. The clinic lights glimmered faintly ahead, a square of pale fluorescence in the gloom, like a lighthouse for the desperate. Caleb's heart leapt, but when he pushed through the double-glass doors, the warmth inside mocked him more than it comforted. The linoleum floor gleamed, the heater hummed, and the smell of antiseptic clung to the air. Behind the desk sat Dr. Harlan Pierce, a man in his late 50s, tall and angular, with a neatly trimmed gray mustache and rectangular glasses perched low on his nose. His white coat was pristine, his tie knotted perfectly, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, even though slush still tracked across the waiting room. Pierce had the air of a man who had given his life to rules, not people. Raised by a strict father who had once been a lawyer, Harlan had carried into medicine the belief that order was survival and that compassion without structure was weakness. Years of running this small-town clinic had only calcified that belief. Tonight he looked up as Caleb staggered forward, Emma slipping against his shoulder. His voice, clipped and dry, held no tremor of urgency. "Insurance card?" Caleb blinked, the words almost foreign. She can't breathe. Please, she's burning up." His voice cracked, hoarse from the cold. Pierce leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have identification? Documentation? Anything that shows guardianship?" The boy shook his head frantically, shifting his sister so her limp face caught the light. "No, sir, but she needs help now." Pierce's jaw tightened, and his gaze slid past the children as if they were a nuisance. "Without paperwork, I cannot admit her. This is policy. Take her to St. Mary's in Denver. They handle emergency intakes." His words fell like stone. The receptionist, a man in his 40s with thinning hair and lines of fatigue around his eyes, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze soft with pity, but his shoulders hunched in silent defeat. He had seen this before and had learned to look away. Caleb's knees bent slightly, as if the weight of his sister and the rejection together were too much, but he forced himself upright. His throat burned with words he could not form. When Pierce turned back to his computer, the boy simply turned, his sister against him like a fading heartbeat, and walked out into the storm. The chime above the door tinkled, cruel in its cheer. Outside, the snow bit into his face again, and Emma moaned faintly. Caleb whispered to her, words lost in the wind, but he never let his tears fall. He had learned that tears were wasted in winter. Far from the clinic, along a trail that wound into the foothills of the Rockies, a man walked in silence with a dog at his side. Declan Ward was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, his body marked by years of service in the Army. His hair, once dark, was now threaded with early gray, cut close in the military style he never abandoned. His face bore the rugged lines of someone who had seen both desert sun and mountain storms. But it was his eyes deep set, blue but shadowed, that told the true story. They carried the memory of places and people he could never forget. On his left leg, a faint limp showed the lingering wound of shrapnel from an ambush overseas. The cold aggravated it, but he refused to surrender his walks, telling himself each step was practice, discipline, survival. At his side padded Valor, a German shepherd of 5 years, his coat black and tan, thick against the wind. His ears twitched at every sound, his gait steady and controlled, trained but free. Valor had served with Declan during his final tour, a military working dog who had once detected IEDs and saved a squad's life with his warning bark. Declan had fought to adopt him after discharge, and since then the two were inseparable. Where Declan bore silence like a shield, Valor offered presence, loyalty that did not require words. On nights when Declan woke in a sweat, his chest tight with the memory of a friend who had bled out in his arms because no medic arrived in time, Valor was always there, pressing close, anchoring him back to the present. Tonight, as snow swirled around them, Declan's steps slowed, his breath steaming in the dark, his mind wandering back again to that battlefield memory. He saw his comrade's face, heard the fading voice, the endless cry for help swallowed by static. It was why he avoided people now, why he had chosen Rivers Bend's solitude. He could not watch anyone die again. Valor suddenly stopped, ears forward, body tense. Declan frowned, scanning the snowy path. He trusted Valor's instincts more than his own. The dog gave a low rumble, not of threat but of attention, as though something in the distance called. Declan shifted, adjusting his coat against the wind. But before he could investigate further, the storm carried away the sound. He exhaled slowly, rubbing Valor's neck. Easy, boy. Not tonight. Yet deep down he knew. Valor rarely signaled without reason. Back in town, Caleb pressed forward along empty streets, snow soaking through the thin soles of his boots. Emma's head rested heavily against him, her breath shallow, her small hands cold against his chest. He could feel her slipping, but he kept moving because movement was the only thing left. He passed shuttered shops, windows frosted over, and a bakery with a broken sign swinging. Not a soul looked out, not a door opened. He whispered, "Just hold on, Em." Just a little longer. The wind howled in answer, and somewhere in those same streets, Declan and Valor turned a corner, their footsteps muffled by snow. They did not yet see the boy and the girl, but the night was drawing them closer. Fate, or something like it, was setting its stage. The storm pressed harder as the town of Rivers Bend lay hushed beneath its white burial shroud. Snowflakes spun like ashes in the wind, clinging to shuttered windows and rattling loose shingles on the rooftops. The streets had emptied long before nightfall, leaving only the faint crunch of boots or the rare sweep of headlights to prove that life still dared move against the cold. Declan Ward had grown used to this silence. He even sought it out, as if solitude itself could erase the noise of war that refused to leave his mind. But on this night, as he and Valor turned a corner into the heart of town, the silence carried something different, a fragile echo, the sound of labored breaths, and the uneven stumble of a child's steps. Valor stopped first, ears snapping upright, his whole body bristling with alertness. His paws sank deep into the snow, nose lifting into the icy air, and he gave a sharp bark that cut through the storm like a warning shot. Declan's head turned, his breath clouding in the glow of a street lamp, and that was when he saw them. A boy no older than 9, half bent beneath the weight of a smaller figure clinging to his back. The boy's legs shook with every step, his sweater soaked through with snow, but his jaw was clenched with a determination that struck Declan in the gut. The child he carried, a girl perhaps 6 years old, sagged limply, her face pale as if the color had been drained by the night itself. Valor bounded forward, his large frame cutting a dark shape against the snow. Caleb staggered back, clutching Emma tighter, fear flashing in his wide hazel eyes until he felt the dog's muzzle press gently against his side. The warmth of the shepherd's breath seeped through his wet sweater, and Valor, as if sensing the urgency, stood close, nudging Emma's dangling arm until it rested against his thick fur. The dog remained still, tail low, offering the only comfort the children had felt in days. Caleb blinked, the tension in his small shoulders easing, and for a moment he let the dog's steady presence ground him. Declan approached slowly, his figure broad beneath a heavy military coat frayed at the cuffs, his gait uneven from the limp he could never quite shake. His voice, low but steady, carried the cadence of someone used to giving orders and expecting them to be obeyed. "Easy now," he said, crouching so his eyes met Caleb's. "What happened?" Caleb's lips trembled, but no sound came at first. Then, hoarse from the cold, he whispered, "She's sick. They wouldn't help her." His throat worked, but no tears came. He had long since learned they solved nothing. Declan's gaze shifted to the girl, noting the fever sheen on her skin, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Something tightened in him, an ache buried deep but never gone. His daughter's face flickered before his eyes. Emily, 8 years old, bright-eyed and laughing one moment, fading in a hospital bed the next. He swallowed hard, shutting down the memory as he stood. "You can't stay out here, come on." He led them toward the curb where his vehicle waited, an old battered SUV left over from his service years, its dark paint dulled by countless winters, the Army-issued markings long faded. Caleb hesitated, clutching Emma tighter, distrust sparking briefly in his eyes. Declan noticed it and nodded toward Valor. "He's with me, and he doesn't go with anyone he doesn't trust." As if on cue, Valor circled back to Emma, brushing against her lightly. Caleb looked at the dog, then at Declan, and gave the faintest nod. Declan opened the back door. "Get in." Inside the SUV, the air was icy at first, but the seats were broad, worn with years of travel. Caleb slid in, cradling Emma, while Valor leapt gracefully to the far side, curling protectively against the girl's small frame. Declan turned the ignition, and the old engine coughed to life, headlights cutting a path through the snow. As they pulled away, the town's empty streets fell behind, the storm swallowing every trace of their footprints. The heater struggled to push back the cold, but Valor provided what the machine could not. Emma's fingers, tiny and trembling, clutched at his thick coat, and slowly her shallow breaths steadied into a fragile rhythm. Caleb's eyes lingered on the dog, then shifted to Declan, studying the man in the driver's seat. Declan's hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale, his gaze fixed ahead, but shadowed by something Caleb couldn't name. Declan felt the boy's stare and, without looking back, spoke quietly. "What's your name?" "Caleb," the boy answered. "And her?" "Emma. She's my sister." Declan gave a short nod. "Declan Ward. That's Valor." His voice softened on the dog's name, as if saying it anchored him. The road wound out of Rivers Bend, climbing toward the highway that would carry them to Denver. Snow swept across the windshield, and Declan leaned forward, peering into the blur of white, his thoughts drifting despite himself. He saw Caleb's thin arms wrapped around Emma and was pulled back to his own youth, when at 17 he had been sent to basic training. His face still boyish, but his spirit already hardened by loss. His mother had died when he was 10, his father retreating into a bottle, leaving Declan to shoulder the burden of survival too early. That same gaunt determination now looked back at him through Caleb's eyes, and it left him uneasy, as though fate was folding time over itself. Beside him, Emma stirred faintly, her lips parting as though to whisper. Her hand flexed weakly against Valor's fur, and the dog adjusted, shifting closer so her fingers sank deeper into the warmth of his coat. Declan glanced in the mirror and saw Caleb watching his sister with desperate vigilance, every blink of hers matched by his. The sight pierced through Declan's armor, dragging forth the image he had tried to bury. Emily, his daughter, her small hands slipping from his as he begged for doctors who never came. The night she died had cleaved him in two, and no battle since had ever left him as broken. His breath caught, and he forced his eyes back to the road, jaw clenched. They drove in silence, the only sounds the low hum of the heater and the faint whimper of wind through the doors. Caleb shifted slightly, his voice breaking the stillness. "Are we really going to a hospital?" Declan nodded once. "St. Mary's in Denver. Big enough. They'll take her." He paused, then added, "No one will turn her away this time." His voice carried a steel that Caleb didn't understand, but it reassured him all the same. Hours stretched as the SUV climbed through mountain passes, headlights bouncing off drifts piled high. Declan's leg ached with the effort of driving, but he pushed harder, urged by the memory of Emily and the fragile breaths of Emma in the back seat. Valor raised his head once, meeting Declan's gaze in the mirror, as if reminding him that this time he was not alone. By the time the distant lights of Denver glowed through the snow haze, Caleb had dozed lightly, chin resting against Emma's hair. Declan stole a glance at them and felt the faintest stir of something long, buried, a flicker of responsibility, of purpose, perhaps even hope, though he dared not name it. He tightened his grip on the wheel, pressing the accelerator a little more. They were almost there, and this time, no door would remain closed. The highway narrowed as Declan's SUV descended into the lights of Denver, the glow of the city shimmering against the curtain of snow. The storm had not relented, but here the streets were more alive, sirens echoing faintly in the distance, neon signs pulsing against the night. Declan's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as St. Mary's Medical Center rose ahead, its tall glass front glowing sterile white, like a beacon of salvation or judgment. He slowed only enough to ease into the emergency entrance. Before the vehicle had fully stopped, Valor leapt down from the back, planting himself firmly on the curb, scanning every shadow with the vigilance of a soldier still on patrol. Declan opened the rear door, lifting Emma carefully from Caleb's arms. The girl's skin burned with fever, her lips dry, her breath shallow. Caleb stumbled out after him, exhausted but unwilling to release his sister's hand. Together they moved through the automatic doors that hissed open, spilling warm light and antiseptic air into the cold. Inside, the waiting area was half-full homeless men curled in corners, a mother rocking a coughing toddler, an elderly couple whispering nervously. Behind the reception desk sat a man in his 50s, thinning blonde hair combed precisely, his blue eyes bloodshot from fatigue. His name tag read Harold Klein, Admissions. He looked up with irritation, his pen already tapping against the counter. "Forms, insurance, guardian paperwork," he recited flatly, as though the words had long since hardened into habit. Declan's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, a figure strode past Harold with the swiftness of someone who had already made her choice. Grace Bennett, 28, wore pale blue scrubs under a navy cardigan that looked as though it had seen too many overnight shifts. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a loose braid, wisps escaping to frame a face both young and tired. But her hazel eyes were sharp, quick to soften when they landed on Emma. She had been a rising star in Chicago's Mercy General, where her instincts and calm under pressure had saved lives in chaos. But the endless bureaucracy and a tragedy involving a misfiled transfer had driven her away. She came to Denver searching for a place where she might still believe in the work she did. Grace didn't hesitate. "Get her into Bay 2, she commanded, motioning to an orderly. Harold stiffened. "Without authorization?" "I'll take responsibility," Grace cut in, her tone sharp enough to slice through his protest. She turned to Declan. "Follow me." Caleb, gripping Emma's sweater, hurried beside her while Valor trotted silently behind, his nails clicking against the tile, his gaze unwavering as though guarding against unseen threats. Inside Bay 2, the fluorescent light revealed every frailty. Emma was placed gently on a narrow bed, her head rolling weakly to one side. Grace clipped a pulse oximeter onto her finger, frowning at the low numbers. "We need oxygen now." An orderly wheeled over a tank, and soon a mask covered Emma's small face, the hiss of air filling the room. Caleb climbed onto the chair beside the bed, his body trembling with exhaustion, his hand clutching hers as if she might drift away if he let go. Valor settled at the foot of the bed, lying sphinx-like, his amber eyes fixed on the children. Declan remained standing near the door, his broad frame tense, every muscle coiled as though ready to fight a war he could not name. Grace's movements were efficient but gentle, adjusting the mask, smoothing the blanket, speaking in low reassurances. She glanced at Caleb. She's getting oxygen. That's good. She's strong, isn't she? Caleb nodded faintly, his eyes too old for his face. Declan noticed the way Grace leaned down, her voice lowering just for the boy, and for a moment he felt a shift in the air, a reminder that kindness, too, was a form of strength. When Emma's vitals steadied slightly, Grace stepped back, clipboard in hand. She flipped through the admissions record Harold had begrudgingly printed. Her brow furrowed. Mother, deceased. Father, absent. Current address. Her finger tapped the line. Abandoned property, 302 Dockside Row. She frowned deeper. That building was condemned last year. Declan's eyes narrowed. You're saying they've been living in a boarded-up rental? Grace looked at him, her expression grim. It wouldn't be the first time children slipped through the cracks here. She turned another page, scanning social notes. A name appeared, one she recognized. Carl Vance, mid-40s, supposed caretaker when the mother worked night shifts. A thin file of complaints, suspected neglect, possible abuse but never substantiated. Grace's jaw tightened. She remembered the name from whispered reports. Men like Vance drifted through towns, latching onto desperate families, feeding off their vulnerability until they vanished ahead of accountability. She closed the folder sharply. This man had contact with them. If he's still around, they're not safe. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, Harold leaned back in his chair, grumbling to a security guard about lost causes and paperwork nightmares. He was a man who had survived too long in hospitals by bearing his empathy, telling himself that detachment was protection. Years earlier, he had once broken rules to admit a patient without insurance, only to be disciplined and nearly fired. Since then, rules had been his shield. His bitterness tonight was less cruelty than fear of consequence, though he had long since forgotten how to explain it. Inside Bay 2, Declan moved closer to the bed, his shadow falling across Emma's small body. Caleb looked up at him, silent but pleading, and Declan felt that old wound tear open again. He had been powerless once before, but this time he was determined to act. His hand brushed Valor's head, grounding himself in the steady presence of the dog who had never let him down. Valor lifted his ears, as if sharing the burden. Grace scribbled notes quickly, already deciding she would raise this with Child Protective Services, though a voice in her head warned her that files too often vanished into drawers. She glanced again at the children, one asleep under the mask. The other slumped in the chair, fighting to stay awake, and made herself a promise. She would not let them vanish. Hours passed. The monitors hummed softly, Emma's breathing steadier with each cycle. Caleb dozed, head against the blanket. Valor never moved, his eyes glowing faintly under the fluorescent light, a sentinel carved from loyalty. Declan finally lowered himself into a chair, his body weary but his mind relentless. The ghost of his daughter still whispered, but tonight, in this room, he felt the weight of choice pressing upon him. He would not walk away. By morning, the storm had weakened, leaving Rivers Bend blanketed in a heavy stillness. Snow lay thick on the rooftops, clung to sagging gutters, and muffled every sound. The mountains that ringed the town stood sharp against a pale winter sky, their peaks like teeth gnawing at the horizon. Declan Ward stood at the edge of the parking lot outside St. Mary's, his breath steaming as he scanned the road ahead. He had slept little in the stiff hospital chair. Valor curled at his boots, but the restless churn in his chest drove him to act. Caleb had begged him quietly at dawn. We left our things at the house. Emma's sweater, her drawings. Please, I need them. Declan had nodded. He knew too well the weight of losing the last scraps of memory. The SUV rattled along the icy road out of Denver and back toward Rivers Bend. In the back seat, Caleb pressed his small hands into the worn fabric, eyes darting nervously at every shadow. He was gaunt, his blue sweater damp at the cuffs, but his jaw carried the same stubborn set as the night before. Valor sat beside him, massive head resting on Caleb's knee, ears twitching. Each time the boy shifted, the shepherd pressed closer, as if to assure him he was no longer alone. Declan drove in silence, the scars along his knuckles white against the wheel. His mind replayed Caleb's request. A child did not cling to scraps unless those scraps held his whole world. Dockside Row appeared at the far edge of River's Bend, a street half forgotten, where salt wind from the river peeled paint off clapboard houses and porches sagged from neglect. The Hawthorne rental stood at the corner, 2 stories of warped siding and a roof that had lost shingles to years of storms. Its windows were boarded, though one plank dangled loosely, creaking with each gust. Declan parked at the curb, his breath hardening into frost as he stepped out. Caleb followed hesitantly, Valor bounding ahead, paws leaving deep imprints in the snow. The front door bore fresh scratches along the frame, wood splintered and raw beneath chipped paint. Caleb froze, his face draining of color. Valor's ears shot forward, his body stiffening as he sniffed along the jam. A sudden bark exploded from him, low and savage, his hackles rising. Caleb staggered back, clutching Declan's sleeve. His voice cracked in a whisper. "It's him. He came back." Declan crouched, his gaze firm. "Who?" The boy swallowed hard. "Carl. When Mom worked nights, he was supposed to watch us. But he yelled, hit us sometimes, said no one cared if we screamed." His words faltered, shame flooding his small face. Declan's stomach knotted. He reached for the boy's shoulder. "You did nothing wrong. This man won't touch you again." Declan pulled out his phone, scrolling to a number stored under Mark. Deputy Mark Jensen was Rivers Bend's anchor in a town that had grown used to closing its eyes. At 38, Mark was broad-shouldered, his brown hair clipped short, his uniform crisp despite the wear of long shifts. He had joined law enforcement after losing a younger sister to an abusive foster placement, a loss that had carved into him a permanent refusal to overlook the vulnerable. When Declan's voice reached him, calm but edged with steel, Mark answered without hesitation, "Stay put. I'll be there." Declan ended the call and immediately placed another, one his hand had hovered over many times but rarely used. Rachel Bloom answered on the second ring. In her early 40s, Rachel carried sharp intelligence behind rectangular glasses, her auburn hair pulled neatly back even on weekends. A civil rights attorney with a reputation for dismantling corrupt systems, she had been Declan's friend since their military days, when she had worked cases for veterans wronged by bureaucracy. Her voice was clipped but warm. "Declan, if you're calling, it's serious." He told her about Caleb, Emma, and the door. She exhaled sharply. "Text me the address. I'll start digging into this Carl Vance. Men like him always leave a trail." Inside the house, the air stank of mildew and stale cold. Declan guided Caleb carefully, Valor padding ahead with cautious steps. In the corner of the single room that hadn't been locked stood the children's belongings, a threadbare backpack, a few sketchbooks, and Emma's faded pink sweater. Caleb darted forward, clutching the sweater tightly, pressing it to his chest as though it contained his sister's heartbeat. Declan let him have the moment, but his eyes kept scanning, noticing boot prints in the dust near the side window. Too fresh. Whoever had come here was not finished. Valor growled low, his body pressed between Caleb and the door, every muscle straining. Declan decided they would not linger. He herded the boy back into the SUV, heart pounding with the certainty that someone had been watching. While Declan moved, Grace Bennett was walking Rivers Bend side streets with a notepad tucked into her coat pocket. She had returned from her shift at St. Mary's, still buzzing with unease. Files told one story, but neighbors told another, and she wanted the truth. She knocked on door after door along Dockside Row. Most faces that appeared were quick to shake their heads, eyes sliding away with practiced fear. One man muttered, "Don't get involved," before slamming the door. Grace wrote down every refusal, because silence itself was evidence. At last, a door opened to reveal Mrs. Adeline Carter, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair piled into a bun, her round glasses slipping down her nose. Her living room smelled of tea and old books, and her voice trembled with both age and indignation. "Those poor children," she said when Grace mentioned Caleb and Emma. "I saw bruises on the boy's arms. Asked him once. He just lowered his head. And that man, Carl, they said he was watching them? I heard him shouting from the street. It chilled my bones. I called once, the non-emergency line, but by the time an officer came, Carl was gone. No one followed up." Her eyes watered. "I thought someone else would." Grace jotted every word, her chest tight. She thanked Mrs. Carter and stepped back into the cold, her mind sharpening with resolve. As Grace moved house to house, a different figure prowled the alleys at the edge of town. Carl Vance was a man whose presence lingered like a bad odor. In his mid-40s, his frame was wiry but hard, his jaw unshaven, his nose crooked from an old break. He wore a frayed leather jacket over a hooded sweatshirt, his boots caked with salt and mud. Years of scraping by in odd jobs and petty schemes had given him a look both restless and predatory. His eyes darted constantly, calculating exits. He muttered to himself as he walked, the cold smoke of his breath twisting in the shadows. He had heard whispers that someone had been back at the Hawthorne place, and that unsettled him. He had left things there he didn't want found, things that tied him too closely to the children's misery. Valor's instincts had not been wrong. In the silence of the snowbound street, danger was circling, unseen but closer than anyone wished. Declan tightened his grip on the wheel as he drove Caleb back toward Denver, determination etched in the lines of his face. Behind them, River Spen's boarded windows hid truths too long ignored. Ahead of them, allies Mark, Rachel, Grace were moving into position, drawn together by the shadows of the past that now threatened to erupt into the present. The night in Rivers Bend had settled into a silence that felt more dangerous than calm. The snow no longer fell heavily, but the drifts on Dockside Lane gleamed under the pale light of street lamps, creating an eerie stillness broken only by the faint groan of houses long neglected. Declan Ward tightened his coat against the wind as he walked. Valor pressed to his side, ears pricked forward. Caleb had insisted on staying at St. Mary's with Emma, but Valor's sharp restlessness would not allow Declan peace. The shepherd had paced relentlessly, nose toward the north, until Declan understood. Something was wrong at the Hawthorne rental. When they reached Dockside Lane, Declan slowed, the faint beam of a porch light casting shadows against warped siding. Then he saw it, a figure crouched at the Hawthorne door, crowbar glinting in hand. Carl Vance, his wiry frame bent close to the lock, breath steaming as he muttered under his hood. Valor's growl rumbled deep, vibrating through the snow. Declan's hand instinctively gripped the leash tighter, though he knew the dog's discipline would hold. He stepped closer, his voice sharp and commanding. "Carl Vance!" Carl jerked upright, eyes flashing, crowbar raised as if ready to swing. But headlights swept down the lane, illuminating the scene. A police cruiser rolled in silently, tires crunching against the ice. Deputy Mark Jensen emerged, broad-shouldered and steady, his badge gleaming faintly in the cold light. His hand rested on his holstered sidearm, but his tone was measured. "Drop it, Carl. Now." Carl sneered, his crooked nose wrinkling, but Valor lunged forward with a bark so fierce it echoed off the houses. Carl flinched, stumbling back, the crowbar clattering against the porch steps. In an instant, Mark moved in, twisting Carl's arms behind his back with the practiced precision of a man who had done this 100 times. Declan stood close, Valor planted firmly between them, amber eyes never leaving the man who had once terrorized 2 children. Mark cuffed Carl, his voice cold. "Attempted burglary, child endangerment, abuse investigations reopened. You're done." Carl spat onto the snow, muttering curses, but his defiance looked thin under the weight of the night. He was shoved into the cruiser, the door slammed shut, and his shadow disappeared behind glass. Valor exhaled through his nose, his bark fading into a low chuff of victory. Declan knelt briefly, rubbing his neck. "Good boy. You ended this." 2 weeks later, the courtroom in Rivers Bend buzzed with tension. Townsfolk filled the benches, whispering, their breath clouding in the chilly air that seeped through old courthouse walls. At the plaintiff's table sat Declan, his frame dressed in a simple navy suit, Caleb and Emma seated beside him. Emma's cheeks had regained color, her pink sweater washed and mended. Caleb wore the same blue sweater, but his posture was straighter, his small hand wrapped protectively around his sister's. Valor lay at their feet, tail curled, wearing a polished collar that seemed almost ceremonial. Judge Miriam Hale presided, her silver hair drawn into a severe bun, reading glasses perched low on her nose. Known across Colorado for her intolerance of cruelty and her sharp fairness, she surveyed the courtroom with clear eyes. She read the charges aloud. Carl Vance child abuse, unlawful entry, attempted burglary, intimidation. The testimonies were presented. Grace Bennett's account of the children's condition, Mrs. Carter's brave words about bruises and screams, Rachel Bloom's thorough documentation of Carl's repeated offenses. The evidence stacked like bricks, impossible to ignore. Carl sat shackled, his narrow face twisted with defiance that cracked under the gavel's weight. Judge Hale's voice was firm. Carl Vance, for your crimes, this court sentences you to 12 years in the state penitentiary. His glare swept toward Caleb, but before it could land, Valor shifted, rising onto his forepaws, a low growl rolling through the chamber. Mark Jensen, seated nearby, leaned forward just enough to block Carl's line of sight. Carl lowered his eyes. Then Judge Hale turned her attention to Declan. In the matter of guardianship for minors Caleb and Emma Hawthorne, her voice softened. This court finds Mr. Declan Ward fit and proper. Guardianship is hereby granted, effective immediately. Emma's small gasp filled the silence, and Caleb's lips curved into the first genuine smile in months. Declan's throat tightened as Caleb leaned against him, Emma clutching Valor's collar. In that moment, the soldier who had lived years with ghosts felt something he had thought gone forever. A family's weight on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a gift. The echoes of justice spread beyond that courtroom. Rachel Bloom, sharp-eyed and resolute, announced the founding of the Rivers Bend Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to housing and health care for abandoned and homeless children. Grace Bennett stood beside her, recognized for her courage in defying policy to save Emma. Together they became voices that Rivers Bend could not ignore. Their press conference stirred donations, volunteers, and a promise that no child would slip through cracks again without someone noticing. Dr. Harlan Pierce, meanwhile, faced his reckoning. Investigations revealed multiple refusals of emergency care, each hidden under the excuse of policy. His license was revoked permanently, his name added to a registry of malpractice. The man who once stood tall in pressed white coats now shrank into obscurity, stripped of the authority he had worshipped more than compassion. 1 year later, Rivers Bend looked different in small but vital ways. On the edge of the forest, a small red-doored cabin stood, its siding bright against the white of winter. Smoke curled from its chimney, laughter spilled through its windows, and footprints trailed into the snow-covered yard where Caleb and Emma played with Valor. Caleb, now sturdier, wore boots too big but laced with pride, while Emma ran in circles, cheeks flushed, Valor bounding beside her with a wreath of pine cones around his neck that she had made herself. Inside, the home smelled of cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter. Declan sat on the porch, his hair more silver now but his eyes lighter than they had been in years. He watched the children chase Valor through the drifts, their laughter piercing the silence that once haunted him. For the first time since his daughter Emily's death, Declan felt that the past no longer held him captive. Instead, it had led him here, to this family rebuilt from ruin. At the annual town gathering, Valor was led onto the stage by Caleb, who struggled to hold the leash against the dog's proud stride. The mayor, beaming, placed a medal around Valor's neck, engraved with the words, "Hero of Rivers Bend." The crowd erupted in applause, children reaching out to pat his thick coat, townsfolk cheering until Valor wagged his tail furiously. But when his amber eyes found Declan and Emma in the front row, his tail beat the floor in quiet triumph. That evening, under a sky sharp with stars, Declan sat with Caleb and Emma on the porch. Valor stretched across their feet, sighing contentedly. The wind carried the scent of pine and the sound of a distant river. Emma leaned her head on Declan's arm and whispered, "Do you think Mom would be happy?" Declan looked at the lighthouse beam in the distance, its light sweeping across the dark as though keeping watch. His voice was steady, filled with a certainty he had not felt in years. "She'd be glad you're safe. And she'd be proud of you both." And for the first time in Rivers Bend's long winter, the night felt warm. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive as sudden flashes of light from above, but through the steady hands and loyal hearts placed in our path. For Caleb and Emma, It was a soldier scarred by loss and a dog who refused to leave their side. Together, they built not just a home, but a second chance at life. Their story reminds us that even in the coldest winters, love, courage, and loyalty can light the way. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that God places people and even animals in our lives at just the right moment to protect us? And if you believe in second chances and the power of love, please like this video and follow our channel for more stories of hope and redemption.